Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Bruno Kreisky Forum. Great pleasure to have you here. It's a premiere for us and a very interesting one. We deal with our security policies, concepts and strategies in a fragmenting world order, and this from an Austrian and a Dutch perspective. Why is that so? First of all, talking about the challenges, political, economic and security challenges of the European Union is one issue. The other one is to look at individual member states and their challenges. So there is a great diversity, as we understand, within the European Union, putting a challenge then to find, as we all know, common strategies, common foreign security policies, etc. So for us here, this evening, it is a particular pleasure and honor to have two experts from the Netherlands here with us, Professor Ruth Mampuys and Dr. Haroon Sheikh. Thank you very much. They will be introduced in greater detail by moderator, Ambassador Eva Nowotny, and of course, thank you very, very much also Dr. Franco Algieri for joining us. Before we start, I would also like to say that, of course, the bilateral relations between the Netherlands and Austria, and I will not go into detail on this, but they are historic ones, talking about the Austrian Netherlands that were once... So not going back as far as that, we also can say that in our contemporary times, we of course share as mid-sized nations, so to speak, one a NATO member, the other a neutral state. We share a lot of challenges and also common interests, which will be at stake and in discussion this evening. Today we talk about, we hear about the security policy challenges here in Vienna, and for us it's also a first, together with the Dutch embassy, and I would particularly welcome the ambassador of the Netherlands to Austria, Peter Potman. Thank you very much. So together in this cooperation, we will go to Graz tomorrow to debate economic security issues, and also with our two experts, and on Thursday we will be in Salzburg. We don't particularly expect you to follow us on this road trip, but please give us, support us with your networks in these federal capitals as much as you can. Because this has, of course, also been one of our objectives to make basically the Kreisky Forum mobile within Austria, and in cooperation and the assistance of the Dutch embassy, this can happen. So I'm particularly grateful for that, and would then like to give the floor again to the ambassador Peter Potman, saying really my great thanks for this excellent cooperation. Thank you, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Sabine. I will be very brief because you didn't come for me, but of course for the panel. Just to say that we're very happy that we've come to this point where we have this first collaboration between the embassy and the Bruno Kreisky Forum. Last summer, when Sabine started as the new Secretary General, we visited here. It was summer and we were sitting outside, and she talked about how she would want more international cooperation and also more activities in Austria itself, outside of Vienna. And I immediately had to think of my friend of many years, Haroon Sheikh, who had finished the report together with his colleagues on the Netherlands in a Fragmenting World Order. And I thought it would be great if we could have a collaboration between the two of us, and also go into the country. And so, well, here we are at the beginning of what I hope is going to be a very interesting roadshow. And as you said, the Netherlands and Austria are very different countries, but they're also very similar on many levels. And certainly we are, both in the European Union at a time of great geopolitical upheaval, both coming from a different past, but with, a very shared future. And so it will be interesting to discover the perspectives and see, and also have an interesting conversation here, of course, with the audience. So with that, I wish you all a great evening, and we're looking forward to the presentation and the introduction by Ambassador Nowotny. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grossbrunn. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Good evening, everybody. As Sabine has already said, the topic for this evening is European security in a fragmented world order. And the fragmented world order indeed is confronting us. I mean, every day we get news, unexpected developments, and you sometimes have the feeling that it's coming, sort of changes are coming like a big wave, yeah, and very difficult to assess, very difficult to put it all in a proper perspective, very difficult to put everything on a how should I say, realistic platform. We are confronted with a situation where so many of the things that we have taken for granted all of a sudden are shattered and challenged. Yeah? Just to name a few, inviolability of borders. We assumed this was a given after the Helsinki Accords, OSCE attained borders in Europe are inviolable. This has been challenged through the Russian attack on Ukraine. Multilateral diplomacy, something which is very important for especially smaller countries to be reliable, to have the reliability on a rule-based international order which is carried by dialogue and multilateral diplomacy. We see constant attacks on the international institutions. United Nations are challenged. Specialized agencies of the United Nations are challenged daily. The United States is leaving the World Health Organization. The United States is leaving the World Trade Organization. All these things that we have taken for granted, we have built up during the last 70 years, are all of a sudden in turmoil and challenged. And Europe is confronted also in an unexpected development of threats, not only from the East, but threats also from the West. We are for the first time confronted with an American government where the president openly speaks of Europe and the European Union as an enemy and as a competitor and a threat to the United States. This was a shock for everybody, and something which has to be dealt with. It's thus completely understandable that the issue of security all of a sudden has gained such an importance in the international dialogue and in fact in everybody's mind. People are concerned about security in many different areas. They are concerned about economic security, about their status in society, but also about threats that are coming from outside. And so we are going to look at these issues in a very broad perspective. And I'm very happy to welcome on our panel here 3 great experts to deal with this issue. And I will introduce, first of all, Mr. Haroon Sheikh, and Ms. Ruth Mampuys. They are both senior research fellows in the Netherlands Scientific Council for Government Policy. That in itself is also something remarkable, that you have a scientific council to advise on government policies and work out for the government options and analysis, provide analysis of the ongoing developments. Interestingly enough, both are coming from quite different fields and not necessarily from political science. Haroon Sheikh has a background in philosophy, I've understood, and he conducts multidisciplinary research on issues relating to the international order and to new technologies and their impact from this perspective. Ruth, her academic background is biochemistry, which is also very interesting, and philosophy of science, philosophy of technology and society, and she examines political decision-making in complex issues and complex situations. And finally, we have on our panel, last but not least, Professor Franco Algieri. He's Professor for International Relations and head of the Department of International Relations at Webster University, Vienna, with a focus on European and Asian security issues, EU-China relations, and also on the EU integration process. The plan for this evening is that Ruth and Haroon will make a brief PowerPoint presentation to introduce us and guide us into their work, which they have been doing for the Dutch government. And then Franco will comment and add his observations, and then we will have a bit of a discussion and then open the floor for discussion with our distinguished audience. I give you the floor. You make it in tandem, and
yes.
you divide the...
We'll do that amongst ourselves.
Euros, yes.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind invitation of being here. The Kreisky Forum, first of all. Sabine, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to having this tour of this country, to be on this wonderful panel with the colleagues here. And thank you, Peter, also from the Dutch Embassy for organizing this for us. Indeed, Ruth Mampuys and Haroon Sheikh from the Dutch Council for Government Policy. We started in Amsterdam this morning, so just like the two of you, we're also reflecting. We started in Amsterdam, came here. You feel you are in a different part of Europe. Geographically also, we were talking for the Netherlands. Austria is very famous for its mountains, and in that sense we are the complete opposite, the low countries. There isn't a single mountain in our country. But indeed, also on reflecting, the idea was in many ways our countries actually are quite similar, as mid-sized countries in the European Union, as countries also that in a very different sense are very active in promoting international peace and approaching in multilateralism in a specific way. So many different ways in which we can think about similarities between our countries. We are indeed here from the Dutch Scientific Council for Government Policy. Let me briefly say something about that, and then we'll talk about our report in tandem in different ways. So the Dutch Scientific Council for Government Policy, what we do is we are an independent advisor for the Dutch government. So we are connected to the Minister of General Affairs and the Prime Minister's office, but by law our position is independent. So we do not represent the Dutch government, we are independent scientists, and we are asked to reflect on complex issues that deal with the wide span of government policy. So we don't deal with short-term issues and not with something specifically in the field of health only or education, but something like geopolitics that touches all ministries, or artificial intelligence, which also has such a big impact, or climate adaptation. These kind of broad topics, that's what we advise on. And we've written a report on geopolitics. We presented that in the summer, the Netherlands in a Fragmenting World Order. by law, the Dutch government is always required to respond to our reports. That actually happened just a few weeks ago, so I think that is only in Dutch, and it's been in Parliament, but it should be able to be translated. You can see what the Dutch government is going to do with our report, and we are still talking a lot about the impact its reports are going to have and what the recommendations the government can take on. So I think that's maybe a bit of an introduction about the report we've written and the work we do with the Dutch government. Maybe Ruth can start a bit about our report.
Well, in this presentation, we will basically try to, well, very briefly, and then of course we look forward to get into a conversation with you, to answer 3 questions. These questions are, what is actually at stake? What do we see is happening? And what should we do? And what should we do? We'll discuss the recommendations we made to the Dutch government. So the waves that we see coming towards us in the last couple of years, and these are not things that happen overnight, and not only happen over the last few years, but if we do step back a little bit, we see some big changes, some big dynamics going on. We see, again, an increase of armed conflicts around the world. We also see that the pillars that we use to lean on, to make our decisions with, our UN structure, is having more difficulty to come to a consensus on the things that are going on in the world. We also see countries rising. We see countries making new cooperations around the world. And we also see that many of the structures that we had and the position that Western countries had in the world, let's say France in the Sahel, are becoming more difficult. So we see some big shifts going on, new countries rising, countries that are accustomed to a certain position are being challenged a lot. So a lot is going on, but not only that, we also say in our report, these are not just all the big developments, these are developments that are actually getting into our societies. We immediately notice in our energy bill when Russia invaded the Ukraine. So we see, and not only that, we see on a lot of different fields, and Haroon will dive a bit deeper into that. We see that it touches all the levels in our society, in our businesses. It's coming very close. So this is another, foreign affairs become domestic affairs. And this is also a big change, also because we are so connected in this world on all different levels, whether it's media, whether it's business, the phones we use, the GPS that we use, everything is so connected. But then before we look into more detail on what is actually going on, our analysis on the fragmentations, we also said, well, if we want to give this some meaning, we also need to ask ourselves, what is actually at stake? And what we used in the Netherlands is this framework of security, prosperity, and values. It is also based on peace, profits, and principles, you could say. And these are actually the 3 key policy interests that a lot of countries, the Netherlands, but perhaps also Austria, need to take into account when they make policy decisions. And they all belong together. It's a balance. You cannot prioritize them or say we choose now this and then that. Security is important, prosperity is important, and values. And for a very long time, it was also mentioned in the introductions, they were all sort of going automatically in the right direction. They were all getting better. For a long time, we didn't really have to worry about our security. Our prosperity was getting better. More and more countries were becoming democratic around the world. So everything was actually going quite well. Business as usual, we could just go along around the world. The world was becoming more globalized. Markets were opening. Everything was going quite well. But what we see now is it will become more and more difficult to find a balance here, because these points are being put under pressure. We need to maybe invest in our resilience, but that might come at a cost of prosperity. And in a world that is only focused on security, we might lose some of our values. And if we want to be less dependent on some countries, some parties, we might need to, it will become harder to discuss things about values. So this, and we will get back to this later. So this is actually what is at stake, the balance between these 3 key values. Now I'll give the word to Haroon again for the fragmentation.
Yes, so The first question we need to ask, what is at stake? And these three things are what is at stake, this is what makes it. But then the next question we asked ourselves, what kind of world are we moving into right now? That was the question we set out in our report. And often you do hear a kind of simple representation, or sometimes you hear the idea, we are going towards the second Cold War. And although there might be some similarities, that's really a too simple presentation of what it looks like right now. The answer we present in our report, and I'll explain that in the coming time, is we are living in a fragmenting world order. With that, we don't mean that there is no order. There is absolutely order. There is all kinds of different projects to create new orders, new kind of forms of cooperation. But with fragmentation, what we mean is, along three axes, there is a process of diversification. Where there was first a more clear-cut perspective, the situation is getting more complex. There is divergence happening. It's happening along the powers, the central powers that are there. There is a process of diversification of power centers, a fragmentation in the arenas in which powers is projected, and finally what we say, a fragmentation in worldviews. I will go through all three of them, but overall what we argue is the situation is getting more complex and these feed into each other, making the situation much more difficult, but also much less overseeable than it was during the Cold War. So let's firstly go into what we mean with fragmentation along power centers. Of course, we can talk a lot about these countries, many details, but let me just be very briefly, what is the conclusion from our idea here? We argue, in contrast with the Cold War, we have now a situation where there are at least 5 major powers, and behind that, a whole set of middle powers, regional powers, strategic powers. 5 great powers, and obviously they are very different from each other, but 5 countries that we should consider for their global impact. And just a brief 1 or 2 sentences on all of them. Obviously, first of all, the US. It was, until recently, the only superpower. We really need to let that sink in, how quickly this changed. In the 1990s, it was the only left superpower. And in a few decades, this has changed. What is important now, and the ambassador already mentioned this country that for a long time has been our ally is not only questioning the alliance, it is in many ways opposing Europe. And that is a challenge we really have no answer for yet. And the second thing I think that's really relevant about the US is, or something to grapple for us with, the US created this world order. It should be the status quo power, but it is now a revisionist power. It is trying to upend the global order. And that is an unprecedented situation, that the country that created this order and supports it is now withdrawing its support. Secondly, China. Obviously a lot to be said about that country, but this is also the biggest change in global order. At the fall of the Berlin Wall, its economy was about the same size as our country, the Netherlands, currently quickly on its way to become the largest economy in the world, a country also with a very elaborate own sense of global order. And many people will be familiar with China's Belt and Road Initiative, its vast investments. It is only one of the big initiatives China is launching. It has the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, and many more. All concepts I think we, at least in the Netherlands, in the West, are too little trying to understand, and concepts that are actually really very relevant in changing global order. We mention Russia as a separate power. Too often it's linked to China as one. We think that's a mistake. Russia as a power, economically, it really doesn't belong in the big league. It's about the size of the Italian economy. But I do think while we should consider it as a great power, at least that I'm speaking here obviously, of course, from Dutch debates, when the whole sanctions and everything started against Russia, we thought once this happens, in a few years' time, Russia will be on its knees. This will hurt the economy so much, it won't survive this. It's still there. It's still a powerful country, and to a great extent, we might say it now thinks it won. So we should consider it still among the great powers. India, we present here, maybe for many people not a country they would consider as a great power, but at least since the last few years we should. First of all, because with all these sanctions, India has been a country that it has never bought more Russian weapons and oil, and in that way has really undermined many of the sanctions we have tried to do here in the West. But also India has become a great power. Internally, it has a tremendous dynamic. For the last few years, it's growing faster every year than China is growing. Its population is younger. It's very productive. And India is in a geopolitical sweet spot. Everyone wants a better relationship with India. Von der Leyen was there with 21 of her commissioners, 21 of the 26. The US is strengthening its alliance. At the same time, Russia is getting better relationship with India. Japan and the global south also sees India as its voice. So India is in a great position. And the EU, finally, you could say the reverse type of power that Russia is. It's an economic giant, but militarily, diplomatically, it actually has more challenges. But whereas in the past we might say we are an appendix to the US, it really, with the current Trump administration, makes it clear we need to be a separate geopolitical entity. Behind this, we have all kinds of medium-sized powers, countries like Turkey, Brazil, South Africa. Not going to dive into it, but the main idea here is this is a global order, not two centers, not two powers. 5 countries with their own concept of order, and all competing with each other, making the situation volatile. The second axis of fragmentation that we saw is fragmentation along arenas of power. And what we mean with that, traditionally, geopolitics is about the military domain. And of course, we're talking about that a lot now. We're talking about the tanks, the rockets, the drones in Ukraine. We're talking about nuclear war, again, indeed. But there is also a real big difference now from in the past, and especially from the Cold War time. Because the last 4 decades, we have gone through a tremendous process of globalization. The world is networked. And what we used to think was all this interdependence is going to create peace. Right? It's going to take geopolitics away. But actually what we're seeing now is that geopolitics is happening within this web of connections, or what some scholars call weaponizing interdependence. We're looking at how we're connected, and everyone is seeing whenever we have an asymmetric position, we're going to use it against our opponents. We have tried in our report to map this a bit. I cannot go over it to extent, but just to give you a bit of a view what we're talking about, the extent of this phenomena, it means a weaponization of raw materials, obviously energy, but think also of the rare earth metals that China has in its control. Think about water. Think about food, as Russia blockades the harbor of Odessa. We are talking about the weaponization of infrastructure. Think here about the infrastructure of trade. Harbors from Rotterdam to Piraeus to Hamburg are used in geopolitical battles. We are talking about digital infrastructure, our dependence on the American cloud, the Huawei telecommunications infrastructure. We're talking about financial infrastructure, the SWIFT system that's weaponized. We're talking about the weaponization of technology and knowledge. The chip sector, both for your country and for our country, a very relevant sector, and we see geopolitics is really a lot focused on this, about becoming more sovereign and using it as a leverage against other countries. But think also of biotechnology, medical technology, ever since COVID, and the power it gives, artificial intelligence. We're seeing geography in new ways being weaponized, whether that's the North Pole that's melting because of climate change, and now everyone wants to have access to Greenland, or the new routes that are coming free through the northern route, but also space. And we can see here what power this brings. One person, Elon Musk, with his Starlink, has the capacity to have an impact on the Ukrainian military. So space. People are used in all kinds of conflicts, either through migration, using it as a weapon against your border, your neighbors. People in the sense of diasporas that are mobilized, countries that are using these people. Criminal networks. Well, I can go on long enough, but this phenomenon just shows this is really a different and unique situation. It's not just about weapons over there. It's about all these connections that go throughout our societies. Finally, the last of the fragmentations, and then we'll discuss what we say, well, what should we do about this, is what we call a fragmentation along worldviews. What we mean with this, of course, is not that there are now more worldviews than there were in the past. I mean, there have always been many different worldviews. But we mean it in a very specific sense. You could say that throughout the 20th century, you could understand a lot of the global developments with a single worldview. During the Cold War, you could say the battle between communism and capitalism, you can understand a lot. What happened in West Berlin, what happened in Cuba, what happened in North Korea. That lens was enough for most of it. And then, after the fall of the wall, you can think about this worldview of globalization and convergence. It helped you understand a lot. The entrance of Eastern Europe into the European Union, the entrance of China into the WTO in 2001, of China 2012, all kinds of new multilateral institutions, were all this end of history story. But what's happening now is that if you want to understand global politics, you need to take several worldviews into account. And that also means it's harder to understand why actors are acting in a certain way, because we need to understand their worldviews. So we still have this worldview of globalization and convergence. Whenever friends are talking with each other, they use this worldview. Within Europe, we're talking about, let's get more convergence. But this is also when China goes to Africa, it also has this story. Let's connect, let's trade, let's invest in each other. So it's still one of the views. But it also competes with what you could call a post-colonial or anti-imperial worldview. That has a long history, but during the Cold War, these countries were weak. In Africa, they still needed to become independent. India also was really a very poor country at that time. These post-colonial countries are now in a more powerful position. And if you hear the Indian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jai Shankar, this is his worldview. He is no fan of the West. It's very critical for us, because it's now in a country in a position of power, and it is really almost very strongly opposed against Western power projection. But also many African countries in the Sahel that say, you want our resources? Well, not in the way it happened in the past. So this is a worldview important to understand global politics. A worldview of revisionism and humiliation. The worldview that a certain country or people used to have a great status, it doesn't have it anymore, and now we need to revise the global order to again create a better position. This is the worldview that might help us explain better the thinking in Moscow. And I think many of us thought, right before the war, that Moscow also thought in these terms. They thought, well, they get so much money from the gas, they won't really go to war. But it was this worldview that was more important. The belief that Ukraine should be, that Ukraine should be a part of a great Russian empire that needs to be restored, is maybe one of the things why it was difficult to understand what Moscow was thinking. It's in Moscow. It's also a worldview very prevalent in Beijing. Our country used to be a great power, then a century of humiliation, and now we're coming back. But you could also say MAGA is also revisionism. Make America great again. We used to be this great country, and now everybody is abusing all our institutions and our money, so we need to get back to that position with revision. A fourth worldview, often linked, but very different also, is one you could call of populism and authoritarian democracy. It's not just that we believe, we had this idea everyone was becoming democratic. Democracy itself is now challenged. Some believe in the need of strong leaders, the idea that the true people needs to speak out, and that we have a corrupt elite, and the elite needs to go away. This is a worldview that you can find, obviously, in countries like Russia, but also in China, perhaps. But it's also getting closer, obviously, of course. Viktor Orban in Hungary, very prominent example of what he called illiberal democracy as an alternative to our democracy, all around populist movements, also in our country, the Netherlands. A final worldview we mention here is a worldview of traditionalism and defending culture. This is again a different worldview, and it basically says, well, we should divide the world in those people who want to protect their culture or traditions and those progressives who are trying to undermine it. A belief that we should protect our religion or community values. And this can take very different forms, from very moderate conservative movements all the way to, you could say, Russia's Orthodox Church trying to expand in Africa, linking with conservative Christians in the United States and elsewhere. And then, for instance, seeing all kinds of policies on gender equality, against oppression, or sustainability as the enemy. Which worldview you have also changes who you see as your friends and foes. And that makes this situation much more complex, and that's why we speak of a fragmenting world order. Next we talk about what we should do then, at least, or what we advise the government.
Finally, we get to the easy part. I'm going to stand over here before I fall off. Yes, so then what to do? In our report we have issued a series of recommendations to the Dutch government. But before that, we also told them what not to do in a more general sense, which can be very important. So we issued 3 things to be cautious of when looking at our recommendations. The first one is BOW, business as usual. We said, please be cautious of looking at all these developments as in we can tweak a little bit here and there and then just go back to where we came from. These developments really call for imagination, for really thinking things through in a different way because things are changing in a big way. The second one is simplification. Please be cautious of simplification, looking at things in a too simple way, because as Haroon just explained in our analysis, things are quite complex. Things are not black and white. It's not either war or peace. It's not this country is always the bad party, or we shouldn't deal with them. It's much more complex than that. And the last one is hiding. We told the Dutch government, you cannot hide behind the Dutch dikes, so to say, and wait until the storm will blow over. Because not doing anything is also choosing, is also making a choice, or the choices are maybe made for you. So these are the three things we told the Dutch government to be cautious of. And then we said, okay, but what can you do? These are the three main recommendations. The first one is increase the geopolitical robustness of the Netherlands. And what that means, we detailed them a bit more in the report, is invest in the necessary expertise and knowledge. So that means not only knowledge on the power centers of the countries and their history, but also on the different arenas of power. I mean, when the whole ASML case became a hot topic in the Netherlands, policy officers had to get to know how actually the chip sector works in detail, because that's important, and that's actually an important thing for all of these power arenas. Infrastructure, technologies, and finally also worldviews. We need to be knowledgeable about how people, what their perspectives are. And then, as we have also seen, this is not something simply anymore for the Ministry of Defense or Foreign Affairs. This really is an important topic for all departments, for all ministries. They all need to be more aware of the geopolitical dynamics that are going on. It also means to invest in national resilience, we told the Dutch government. But the final one for the first one is to be cautious of securitization. It's a very human response that we have big threats coming at us. We look at everything through the glasses of safety and security, but that comes at a cost. So we need to look at it also from a different perspective. Second, recalibrate the Netherlands' engagement in multilateral cooperation. And this means on a European level, on an international level, invest in multilateral cooperation, but it also means look at new partners. Where can you cooperate? Maybe some countries or some parts that you never looked at before. We need to open our eyes more. It's also the business as usual point. Look beyond what you're used to, because a time like this really calls for creativity, opening your eyes and see what you can do. And finally, mobilize and engage with the whole of society. There are big changes maybe coming at us, so this means we need to explain what is going on for people to understand and support maybe some hard decisions that need to be made. And also in a more positive way, the government doesn't have to do all of this alone. You can cooperate you will need to cooperate, and you can cooperate with society, with companies, with all sorts of organizations, and we need to cooperate all together. That said, we also have just some points, I will very briefly go through them, some considerations for the focus that we're talking about tonight, considerations for security policy that we think might be useful for the discussion. Now, well, building a geopolitical EU as a security environment deteriorates. Haroon already mentioned the last big change of the American position really calls for us to look at our own position and where do we stand and what can we do. Coalitions of like-minded middle-sized countries within the EU, maybe cooperation between Austria and the Netherlands. We have some things in common, like the chip sector, as already mentioned. But also abroad, outside of the Netherlands and outside of Europe. Creative new partnerships globally is really what is needed, also for security policy. Resilience across all arenas of power projection. These are the arenas that we mentioned. The whole of society approach. We need to get into contact and discuss this with everybody. And be cautious of securitization. With that said, I will now give the floor back to actually Franco, I think. Yeah.
But thank you very much, Haroon. Thank you very much, Ruth, for this thought-provoking presentation. There are so many issues which merit a deeper going discussion now. And I think especially with your last point, I'm glad you made this emphasis, because it seems to me everything which you recommend in your recommendations has to be seen in the context of European policies. I mean, we are all in a situation, we are members of the European Union, and everything which we foresee or which we discuss in our own national security environment has to find its place in the European security environment. And I think this is the sort of the focal point of that whole endeavor. Franco Algieri, I think you might have something to say about the European Union development. Huh?
Well, let's see. So thank you, first of all, for the invitation to the Kreisky Forum, the Dutch Embassy also, and congratulations to my two colleagues for this report. I had, of course, the chance to look at this report a little bit earlier, because when I received the invitation for this panel, I did not go through all these more than 100 pages in Dutch, because my Dutch is not good enough. But luckily, you have this wonderful and excellent English summary as well. And then also based on your presentation here, I would like to comment on a few of these points. And I would like to comment now, not, let's say, as the Austrian perspective. I'm German and I'm Italian. I have two nationalities, and I live in this country, in this beautiful country, since 17 years. And I have no intention to move away from here. So I would say I bring it in from a European perspective. And as you said, it is a European topic. And also from the background of my research that I'm conducting. Well, a few observations. The report actually reflects realities, but not only Dutch realities. I think it reflects European realities. And no matter whether you are a small, medium-sized, or a large country, many of these recommendations here, or these observations here, also do apply to France, do apply to Germany, for example, and of course also to Austria. So this is something which we have to consider. Now, the observation that the favorable international environment is gone or is eroding is something. When I read it, I would agree, but then I was asking myself, what is a favorable international environment? What is it for the Dutch? What is it for the Austrians? What is it for the Germans? For the Italians? What is it actually? And my understanding would be here that we have been working with the assumption over the years that such a favorable international environment is what we often call this Western liberal international order. So that this is our favorable environment, plus an environment where we could profit from a hegemon and a hegemonic stability, or perceived hegemonic stability. Now, in the case of Austria, it's a little bit different, but for the NATO countries, in the NATO context with the United States. And now we are witnessing, I would not say suddenly, a departure from the United States. We were actually in a phase where we had already something which was indicating a departure from the United States, a withdrawal from Europe. This was after the end of the antagonistic system in the 1990s, when the US was refocusing and starting to refocus its interests because it could not fight three theaters at the same time. And this was the time when we Europeans actually started to tell the world, we can do it. Yes, we can. This was the 1990s, yes, we can, of the Europeans. We had a common foreign and security policy developed. We had first we called it European security and defense policy, then we called it common security and defense policy. And in the end, and this is what we already realized throughout the first decade of this post-antagonistic world order in the 1990s, we could not. We needed NATO and we needed the United States. And it was then, interestingly enough, it was actually, and a lot of people said it's depending on the member states, the Brits and the French, of course, and the Germans. Where will the Germans go? And in Germany, it was actually a government composed of a social democratic chancellor and a green foreign minister who were actually more proactive in European defense integration than former governments actually were. So this is one of the points. We already were in such a situation, and now we have a kind of, in a different way, a déjà vu, where we say, oh my God, the US is disappearing. Now, we are now in the year 2025. This was in the 1990s. Now, talking about considering your power centers, when you are describing these power centers, where I think this is very clear, and also here seeing that there is this interdependence between these power centers, I was wondering, and this is also, of course, in international relations, we are discussing this for ages now, is this a form of polarity? And in the report, you are also using this term unipolarity. Now, I'm always wondering throughout my research whether actually what kind of polarity we have and what kind of international order we have. And in the 1990s, there were reports about a new international security architecture, a new European security architecture. Maybe I missed it, but I haven't found it so far. So where is it? Because we are still working with old assumptions and old patterns and old behaviors, especially here in Europe. So what is it? Charles Groothammer, yes, he was famous for framing this term unipolarity and then talking about first the unipolar moment and the unipolar era, something which he was not amused that the US should be this unique pole here in the world. I was wondering whether even in the 1990s we were in a unipolar world. Whether this is really something that could be called a unipolarity. And this leads me to your point with the 5 superpowers, or these 5 middle powers, what you call it. Here again, I'm skeptical whether we could call some of these superpowers, because when you have a superpower, in the Cold War we used this terminology, but it's about the capability to project power. And who of these 5 powers that you have mentioned in here has actually the capability to protect such a power that you could call it a superpower? And my answer would be none of them. Neither the Chinese, nor the Americans, nor the Russians, nor the Indians, nor the European Union. None of them can and then this is what Haas called a non-polar world. And this is highly dangerous. And this is a highly problematic world where you have a non-polar world, because then this form of balancing is missing. And this is actually the fragmentation that you are describing here. When it comes to your arenas, the same here, in which of these arenas these powers can project power and can be kind of leading powers within these different arenas. I would not expect that one of these powers is then present in all these arenas protecting the power, but maybe in some of these arenas. When it comes to your worldview, and this is also in the current debate, when I sometimes witnessing this kind of, oh my God, what is happening now? The US is withdrawing, and this will be a new world, and this is a wake-up call for Europe. When I got a little bit upset when I read comments in the media, not only in this country, but in several countries, that, oh, this is a wake-up call for Europe. And when I heard European politicians and from member states politicians saying, this is the wake-up call for Europe, did everybody forget that Donald Trump was already president 8 years ago? And we had debates about this is now the wake-up call for Europe. Exactly. By the way, 8 years ago, when he was the first time president, I was in Berlin at a conference on US-EU-China relations. And there were colleagues who said, this is now the moment for the European Union to create, together with the Chinese, a bipolar world. I said, no, sorry, guys. No, it's not working because we cannot do it and the Chinese don't want it. Now, again, here, I'm reading, this is not a moment for China and the European Union to form an alternative model to the United States. So another déjà vu, we already have it. And also with respect to these worldviews and these forms of antagonism, this was something that was already creeping up. And when Christopher Clark, I think this title for this one book he wrote about the sleepwalkers, when he talked about World War I, we are today in Europe pretending like sleepwalkers again. It's the same thing. It's creeping up. We see it. We saw the dissolution of former Yugoslavia, and we could not react. We are seeing a European Union that is very ambitious to develop a lot of capabilities, but we are very slow. Yeah? And then certain things we do not. We always need shocks. We need internal shocks or we need external shocks in order to react. Now, coming to your final consideration, so what is at stake for the Netherlands? What you describe for the Netherlands, my answer would be the same things are at stake for all the other EU member states. And then one of the words I'm really kind of, not because you use it, but when it's used in a political context, resilience. I cannot hear resilience anymore. What does it actually mean? To give you a short example, the German government has been very pro-China. And a lot of Chinese investments have been taken in Germany. Now, what is happening? After a while, the German government is realizing, oh my God, the Chinese are investing in critical infrastructures. So we have to do something. The European Union is then also realizing this, and suddenly it is then Europeanized this topic. And not only Germany, also some other countries were afraid of having too much external influence into their critical infrastructures. So what is coming up? Resilience, a resilience concept. And what do we see? What is actually the resilience concept? In my view, not much. How is it implemented? We are still falling back into old patterns and into old behaviors, because now we say, okay, in the end, if the US is moving away, so what does it mean in context with the relationship towards China? And I'm wondering, what about these words, and what about a 2019 communication of the European Commission talking about a systemic rival and an economic competitor? And now suddenly we think again in terms, maybe it's pragmatic to be now a little bit with China, because then we have an alternative to the United States. So I'm a little bit puzzled with this resilience concept. Now to the recommendations. What I loved this one sentence when you, and you also mentioned it when you said that the Netherlands should avoid the danger of simply retreating behind the dikes. Austria should avoid to simply retreat behind neutrality. And the European Union should simply avoid to retreat behind a model which it believes ideationally is perfect, but that this is a model which the whole world loves and embraces. On the contrary, we have to defend this model very, very strongly. Development safeguard necessary, just to some of the final recommendations of your presentation, the necessary expertise. I think that's one of the most important things. Now, the challenge here is again, I read it the other day, by the way, or I got it from a university institute in your country. I got a message, they are under threat now because some governmental funding is reduced, not only in the United States, also in Europe this is happening. And we know that with some governments, we see it in some of the European countries, expertise and research is not necessarily the thing that should be funded. So here we have to really be very, very careful. Then the broad-based policy to global fragmentation, so this interconnectedness, yes, thinking much more, and this is also, I think, what this idea of the Kreisky Forum is, this multilateralism, interdependence, and strengthening is. And the mobilization of the society. It's happening. That's very good, and this is why I highly, highly appreciate such events that you have to mobilize the society. And finally, the geopolitical European Union and like-minded ones. I would love it if it works out. And since I'm a lifelong optimist, I think it's still possible, but time is really moving fast. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Franco. I think it's very, very important that you've reminded us how many wake-up calls we have had in the last 20, 30 years. And indeed, we had many of them. And They always were sort of treated with great enthusiasm and planning and forward moving, but in the end, action and results were very limited. We had not so long ago in a discussion forum here, Natalia Docci, the Italian political scientist who was working for Federica Mogherini, and she was one of the principal also of the global strategy, global European strategy report. She said in the discussion, she coined that image that Europe is a juicy chicken that sits in the jungle. Yeah? And the jungle is all around us. And the juicy chicken sits in the middle. And everybody knows what the fate of a juicy chicken in the jungle is. And I think it's extremely important that Europe not only responds to a wake-up call, but in fact really decides on strategies and concrete measures how to recalibrate the situation and how to get out of this sort of jungle situation. Haroon, would you like to comment on what Franco has been saying, or shall we move into
I think we've talked a lot. I mean, thank you. We just appreciate it. I mean, I think what you've done is brought all the main topics of our report, questioned them, deepened, brought things to consideration. So thank you very much for that. But I think it's better to have the discussion amongst ourselves.
We open to the floor, and the ball is yours.